these tails went back this way. Spring this
telefoil. They didn't work with the kind of phones they had back then.
This is what I'm nervous about.
So we have a lots of work up.
They're back hard.
Coming. Lydia is finishing her audiology and she has spoken implants. She maybe can help you out.
But no, they're nervous about when they're down on the ground.
You probably already know. I know, you probably already know.
Yeah, so I usually just count
You
them on
haven't
my
put
finger.
your implants. You can't do
Quite a
one.
few. I have a flicker.
Can't do
And I see the crackles coming back.
But see, I have a
Yeah, I had
regular
I had two of them.
and, yeah.
Well, we can talk afterwards.
Oh.
Well, good evening, everyone. I know people had trouble finding parking out there. We have a good crowd tonight, so Larkin brought them in tonight, so that's good. My name is Mark Broman. I'm the Executive Director of Wachiska Audubon. Wachiska is a local chapter of National Audubon. We've got 17 counties in our geographical area, so basically all of southeast Nebraska. And you can follow us on our website and Facebook. I've got a couple announcements tonight, but I'm going to have Jason come up. He's got a couple things he wants to mention from Spring Creek, so I'll have Jason come up and give those, and then we'll get right back to some additional announcements. So here's Jason.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Jason the Bird Nerd from Spring Creek Prairie. I just wanted to let you know, most of you already know this, I'm sure. Tomorrow starts the Great Backyard Bird Count, right? 4 days all the way through Monday. The easiest and most fun Great Backyard Bird Count, right? All you need to do is about 15 minutes. You can do it from inside if the weather isn't good, but that doesn't look like a problem. So get outside, count some birds wherever you enjoy that. We're leading some walks if you want a guided walk. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday out at Spring Creek. So count some birds over the weekend, please. It's an important community science project. Lets us know how our local bird populations are doing. The other thing is watch the newsletter and or some emails in the future from Wachiska out to membership about native plants. Spring Creek and Wachiska, we're partnering with the city to kind of learn more about how many people are using them. Even if you're not using us, let us know and tell us why you're not using them in your landscape. They're really important for birds, but we're trying to get the city to maybe start to update some of our ordinances and also to consider maybe some more different types of incentives, right? They've got one right now for rain gardens, but they don't want to have one for maybe a pollinator or a bird habitat garden. And that's really important for our climate, our birds, lots of other things. So watch for that survey. It literally takes 5 to 8 minutes. Fill it out. That will help us get more data back to the city, and they can help us kind of keep updating on how we use and how important our native plants are for our birds and our people. So watch for those. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Jason. And Dave was kind enough to bring some flyers. So out on the front table, some flyers. Make sure and sign in if you didn't get a chance when you came in. If it was crowded, didn't get a chance to sign in, go ahead and sign in when you leave tonight. And I'll also talk about some postcards here in a minute. They're out there. The postcard, well, I'll just jump right into that. The postcards that are out front are from National Audubon, and they asked us to circulate them to our members, and you can sign them tonight and then turn them in. But I'm just going to go ahead and read what it says. It said, local communities are ready to lead on conservation. We urge you to co-sponsor the Local Communities and Bird Habitat Steward Act. This bipartisan bill empowers communities to protect their natural heritage and bird habitats while engaging residents in conversations that reflect local priorities. Supporting this bill means investing in locally driven conservation and more resilient communities for both birds and people. Thank you for your support. And then you just put your name and address down here, and at the top you put in your congressman. This is going to Congress. So most of you here tonight will be District 1 Congressman Mike Flood, but there will be a few people from Don Bacon's district, District 2, and then Adrian Smith, District 3. So if you want to just sign one of those tonight, out there and leave it, then we're going to send these back as a package, and when they go to DC and go up on the Hill, they're going to take these from chapters all over the state. So they asked if we would take these to events the next couple of weeks, so we'll have them here, and if you know someone that wants to sign one, get a hold of me, but we'll hold them for a couple of weeks here before we send them off to New York so that they can take them down to the Hill. Let's see, I might have Teresa come up now. She's going to do a little presentation on the bylaws before I get into a couple other things. So then we'll get into other things. But anyway, before you leave, pick one of these postcards up and just fill it out while you're here. It's real simple. Like I said, just put your congressman's name up here and your name and address down here. Leave it here, and we take care of the rest. Teresa Pella is our president. She's going to talk about some bylaw changes. And with that, I'll turn it over to Teresa for a few minutes.
Okay, thank you,
So
Mark.
you're gonna wing it on your own?
I'm on my own?
Yeah.
Gee, I don't know. Pressure's on, Linda. Okay, yes, I'm Teresa Pella, the current president of the board. And recently, we have completed our biannual review of the bylaws, and the board is recommending the following updates be adopted by the membership. So if you're a Wachiska friend and/or a National Audubon member, you get a vote. This is a pretty low-key exercise. So we'll start with, and Wendy has copies. If you didn't see the bylaws, there's hard copies, a few hard copies that Wendy has. If you want one, raise your hand and she'll deliver one to you. Okay, so the Constitution, the paperwork when Wachiska was formed was created into two separate documents that are merged into one, the Constitution and the bylaws. So the Constitution itself is very short. It's kind of, here's the purpose of this organization, here's our mission. We did add the vision, our current vision. That was not in there, so we put that in, inserted that after the mission. We also clarified in the Constitution the relationship between local chapters and National Audubon. Through the years, there's always been questions of who are we, what are we, you know, how do we fit under the umbrella? So just in general, local chapters are independent organizations. We have our own 501c3s. We do not get funded by national, other than a little kickback on membership dues that people pay to national. We can apply for grants. They do have, what do they call them, Audubon in Action type grants that we can apply for. But we are not directly funded by Audubon. That's why one of the reasons that the Friends, Wachiska Friends was formed years ago, was to solidify a group of people who would support Wachiska through the years. So we clarified that in the Constitution. So if you ever have a question, you can always look there. The other thing in the Constitution is what happens if the chapter is dissolved. Before the language was the funds would go, assets would go to Audubon, Nebraska. Audubon, Nebraska is now part of Audubon Great Plains and includes South Dakota and North Dakota. So it's now a regional organization. And then we have, with the recent acquisition of Prairie Pines, we have in our agreement with Prairie Pines Partners that if Wachiska dissolves, they get the first offer for Prairie Pines and vice versa. If they dissolve, Wachiska gets, well, we don't get the offer because we own it. So anyway, after the board talked about this for quite a long time, we decided, you know, we don't know what the future's gonna look like. We don't know which organizations are there. So we've worded, we put the word in there that if dissolved, that at the point in time it is dissolved, the decision on what happens to our assets and liabilities will be donated to another not-for-profit entity with a similar mission as determined by Wachiska's board of directors at that time. So that's what the Constitution language is now that we're asking membership to approve. So that's Constitution. The bylaws revisions that we've put in there are, we kind of changed a little bit on when we elect officers and when we have an annual meeting. We were doing both of those in November, but for the annual meeting, we were reporting out only a partial year of what was happening. We were only reporting out what we did between January and October. So we shifted, we're recommending shifting. We're still gonna have election officers and board directors in November, which then gives the incoming officers and directors a couple of months to sit down on board meetings before they actually officially start their jobs. So that would still occur in November. March is when the board will give the annual report presentation to membership, and we'll talk to, which is actually gonna be next month. We'll come talk to you about, you know, here's what happened in 2025. hear all the opportunities, challenges, and accomplishments. And then we're also gonna be able to give a full year accounting of the financial picture. So please come next month and listen to that. I think it'll be a pretty fun meeting. And then we're gonna share just fun stuff. So that's in there. We updated the duties of the treasurer and clarified responsibilities for that position and the finance committee. A couple years ago, we moved from she was really a volunteer bookkeeper to hiring a CPA firm. So we've been doing that for a couple years. So now we have updated the bylaw language to reflect that the duties of the treasurer have changed a little bit. And the finance committee, we've given them the additional task of also being, and this is more important in some ways, the investment body. They're the ones that are charged with looking at the investments that Wachiska has at Lincoln Community Foundation, some others that come in, and advising the board on helping us decide what should we be doing with those. Are we investing in the right things at the right places? So we've kind of shifted their responsibilities from looking at budgets line item by line item by line item by looking at the overall budget picture with us, but also looking at our investments. So now that has a house within Wachiska. And then the Conservation Committee, that committee has renamed itself Prairie Conservation and Management Committee. So we're just changing the verbiage in the bylaws to be in sync with what the committee now calls itself. The purpose of the membership committee, which Linda can tell you all about, that's kind of changed in recent months as National Audubon has changed and has updated its relationships with how it's relating to chapters a little bit. So we've updated the language related to that committee. And then finally, we're replacing the nominating committee, which was a committee that was brought together once a year to find board members for the next year. We're replacing that committee with a nominating and governance committee with the task to and responsibility to help the board identify and put into place best practices, best management practices, and to also help us with a pipeline so we can start creating a pipeline so we have people interested or we think will be good board members. We can start talking to them and engaging people much earlier than we had been. And then that group will also help with the oversight of the executive director performance. So it's a body that will consist of 3 board members and others that the board decides or wants to bring on board. So it's going to help us a lot rather than put so much work on the board, the board chair. So those are the proposed changes that the board is asking membership to approve. Anyone have any questions? If not, I'll entertain a motion from someone to approve the Constitution and bylaw revisions.
I move.
Move, Todd. Okay, do we have a second? Lana, second. Okay, all those in favor of adopting the revisions to the Constitution and bylaws, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Okay, abstain. All right, thank you very much.
Back to a few announcements. I did send out an action alert today, but unfortunately I put March instead of February. I was looking at some things, looking at the Babbling Brook for next month, so I'll send out some sort of a notice tonight, but you'll get an action alert, probably a lot of you that said you wanted to be on that alert. But basically what that alert is, yes?
Raise the mic a
Oh,
bit.
okay, there we go. So anyway, I'll send a retraction out tonight or a correction that should say February, because next week is when we've actually got the hearing on LR 298CA. That's the constitutional amendment that would protect the environmental trust. It would put it to a vote of the people in the fall that would say, do you want the trust money to be spent only through the grant process, a competitive grant process, rather than all these raids that have been happening for years. So we're going to try to get that through this year. It's a slim chance of getting it through because now they're already, a third of the way through the session and it's a short session. But anyway, we're going to give it a good try. But if you did get an action alert tonight, remember that's next week. It's for February and not for March. Another bill I wanted to mention, LB 1072 was the governor's mainline budget bill, one of his 2 mainline budget bills. And in it, it was taking all kinds of funds from Game and Parks and was also taking $40.7 million from the Environmental Trust and transferring $32.7 million to Game and Parks to replace $50 million that they were taking over here. So kind of a shell game. and that money would be used at Lewis and Clark, so it would be used mostly for recreation, which isn't allowed by the Environmental Trust Act, but that doesn't seem to bother the administration. But there were 465 comments that came in on that bill on 472 opposing the takes. Now, there were people involved in there from HHS, Health and Human Services, and then Humanities and Arts, and different groups like that, but a bulk of those were from conservation organizations that were worried about money being taken from NWEE, thanks for some of the funds that they deal with, also Game and Parks, and then of course the NET transfers. So anyway, 465 letters, comment letters, that's real impressive, and it caught the attention of the senators. So we don't know what's gonna happen with appropriations, because that was the budget from the governor. They have to come up with their own budget and then pass the bill to the floor, so we'll see what's gonna happen. It sounds like they're gonna reduce some of those takes. How much, we don't know. So that's yet to come. So watch your emails. It's hard to keep up on things down there. Yes, Mark?
I got an email about that just today.
Yes.
From, I think it was.
I heard there's another group that maybe Appleseed or somebody else also was sending out.
It was from Audubon and I think maybe the Nebraska Land Trust. Two groups together sent a letter earlier,
Okay,
and this was a follow-up on that, and it said there's something next week to write letters about.
yes, that's LR 298
No, it's the
CA.
one, it's the taking the money away from the trust is specifically what it was about.
Okay, so it's probably the budget bill for NWEE. Their budget is on Tuesday, and so you can comment on the NWEE's budget. They already had the Game and Parks and NET budget hearing, but appropriations will be hearing the one from NWE, and they are getting $8 million from the trust in NWEE. So yeah, you can comment on the NWEE's budget bill in front of appropriations. That may be what that email was about. But anyway, yeah, but the big one was 1072 that was last week in appropriations, and then the constitutional amendment's the one coming up. And remember, that's an LR, so it's not an LB, so when you go to look for it, you have to look it up as LB 298CA, meaning constitutional amendment. So it gets passed by the legislature, then it goes to the vote of the people, and then the people can vote if they want to protect the trust and say you can't rate it for any reasons.
Mark, I just wanted to say, I contacted Game and Parks and spoke to
He
someone in
doesn't
their
have it on.
communications division, and she said, I said, does Game and Parks support having this transfer to you to use for a marina and shoreline restoration of one lake? And she said, no, absolutely not. We're totally opposed to any transfer from the trust to us. So at least, I don't know where NDWEE stands, but Game and Parks is firmly against these transfers.
Yeah, they were between a rock and a hard place. They had $50 million taken from them, and then they were saying, oh, by the way, we'll give you $32 million from the Environmental Trust. So they were in a really hard space. The one that's probably the worst part of the Game and Parks takes, they're taking the Wildlife Conservation Fund, which is money from license plates and your tax check-off and donations, and they're going to sweep $1 million from that. Those are donations that people gave for a specific purpose. So there's definitely constitutional grounds there if someone would want to bring a lawsuit. But we'll see what appropriations does. They may tell the governor, we're not going to do that. So there's a lot of things going on down there, but yeah, the bill next week we want to concentrate, or the LR, is that LR 298CA, and that's in Natural Resources Committee. These other bills have been in appropriations, so we've got to watch everything. But yeah, it's kind of a shell game going on down there. But if we could get that constitutional amendment in front of the people and get it passed, that would protect the trust, I think, pretty well. It was drafted very well. Another thing we have coming up, we've got a cedar tree cutting party coming up in March, on Saturday, March 22nd at 10 a.m. That's a Sunday morning. We'll have some saws and loppers, but if you have your own, want to bring them out. If there's bad weather, we'll try to get it out on Facebook and get notice. Or if you let me know you're coming, I'll put your email address down, and if we cancel it or reschedule, I'll let you know. We may have some other events coming up, including at the Arnold Elementary School we did 2 years ago and 3 years ago. So we do have some equipment, but if you've got your own, that'd be great. So again, that's March 22nd, 10 a.m. Teresa already mentioned next month's general meeting is going to be a little bit different. Instead of a speaker, we're going to be talking about 2025, our accomplishments, a little bit about the strategic plan, share stories, and we'll have some drawings. We're going to have some fun prizes. So be sure and come next month for the fun prizes, if nothing else. The spring birdseed sale is underway. It's online, and it'll also be in your Babbling Brook. It'll be coming out in a couple weeks, and Whitney's got copies out there at the desk. So on one side is the order form, the back side is the descriptions of the different kinds of seeds, but you can go online tonight and order, or you can pick up one of these and leave it here, or you can mail it in. So there's a number of ways you can do it, but it is on the online so you can find the seeds there. Let's see, I mentioned that we've got copies out at the front desk. I'd like to ask any Wachiska board members that are present stand. I know we've got a couple of Teresa's here and Tim Knott's here, and I saw Alex. Yeah, so raise your hand or stand up. So we got a couple board members here, so I always like to recognize the board members, so people, if they have something they want to talk to them about, they can grab them. We've got another event coming up called the Bird Encounter. It's at the Anderson Library on March 7th from 10 to 1. We'll have live birds from the Raptor folks, courtesy of Dave Tinnerton. So Dave, thank you for Wild Bird Habitat for helping sponsor that again. And Jason from Spring Creek is one of our partners. And we'll have a lot of different booths. Tim will be there with bird songs and sounds. And we may have a Native American person telling some stories. We're still working on that, but we've got some other booths set up. We'll be making the pine cone bird feeders. So it's really set up for small kids, elementary kids, and families, but everybody's welcome. There's something you can find to do. So again, that's March 7th, and that'll be mentioned in our Babbling Brook, so you can catch it there. Let's see. Let's take a couple minutes and see if we have any unusual bird sightings. We had a female bluebird the other day. That's the first bluebird I'd seen in months out there. But every day we have robins, blue jays, cardinals, mourning doves, nuthatches, and several species of woodpeckers. So we've got a lot of activity, just nothing really bizarre except that one female bluebird. And someone told me they had 8 bluebirds at their house the other day. And I know Ross Scott mentioned he had some bluebirds at his house. I'm sure some of you have too. So has anyone had anything fun or interesting in their backyard, or huge numbers of something? Someone told me they had 40 robins. I saw about 20 the other day out there at Prairie Pines. They had 40 robins in their backyard, so I thought that was pretty impressive. So we have anything? Yes?
We went to Branch Oak on Sunday and saw about 30 bald eagles.
30 bald eagles. Good. Okay. There's someone sent us a picture the other day. Someone in Southwest Lincoln has a eagle building a nest out there. It's very large, and those eagle nests are huge, and they had a picture of the eagle, so they sent it to us to let us know that there was one nesting. And there's also the ones out by Holmes Lake by Talent Plus. They've been nesting there, and I think there's a nest out here on Stevens Creek close to us. I see a bald eagle a lot of times when I go out and get the mail at Prairie Pines. So someone else, we had somebody else over here. Yes, Jason.
We had a flock of about 10 lesser skunk out at Spring Creek.
10 lesser scaup. Okay, on the ponds. When was that?
Just today.
Today. So they're fresh. Okay. Anybody else have anything?
What was that she saw?
Lesser scalps out at Spring Creek at
What
10.
is that? A bird?
Duck. Bluebills. Yep.
I think I may have seen them fly over Pawnee this afternoon.
Very possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll get on because I know what everyone's here for. Tonight's presentation and past presentations are available on YouTube. So if you want to recommend it to somebody to go back, or if you want to go back and watch it, let them know that's the place to go. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Larkin Powell. Larkin grew up on a small farm in southern Iowa. He attended Graceland College, Iowa State University, and the University of Georgia. Larkin and his wife Kelly. Kelly's here tonight helping him sell some books, so be sure and stop by afterwards, and I'm sure he'll sign them for you. His wife Kelly and their son Tristan moved to Lincoln in 2001, so he's been here for a few years now. Larkin's the director for the School of Natural Resources at UNL, and he'll be talking about his new book, The Best Intentions, A Story of Landscape Change in the Heart of the Great Plains, just released last month, so it's fresh off the presses. And he'll take questions afterwards. I'm sure he'll stick around and take questions after we end the formal presentation, but with that, I'll give you Dr. Powell.
Thanks, Mark, and good evening, everybody. I've enjoyed over the years coming to chat with you all several times. There's been different topics, but you've always asked, I think, the best questions of anybody, so I always am a little scared. But we're fine. We're gonna be okay. Maybe 2 or 3 talks ago, I gave a talk here called Hitler's Effect on Landscapes of Nebraska. I'm pretty sure that I gave that talk to you all. That was when I thought the book was almost done, and that was probably about 8 to 10 years ago. I started the book in 2005, right after I moved to Nebraska, and it's been actually a way for me to gain appreciation of my adopted state, coming from southern Iowa. So, but I'm very glad it's done, and very happy to share some of the themes with you tonight. We're going to start. I was a wildlife population biologist. Most of the things that I did research on happened to be birds, so I think that aligns well with this audience. And if you don't mind, we'll talk a little bit about birds tonight to tell some of the story. I didn't think you would mind that bad, but we're also in the midst of that. Just because this is Nebraska, we'll be talking about farmed landscapes tonight. And the picture up here is obviously a landscape of days gone by. And so we'll think a little bit during the talk about how we got to where we are today with today's landscapes. So let's use maybe one of your favorite birds. It's a bird that I did a lot of research on for over a decade, the greater prairie chicken. And let's start with that just to kind of give a quick story as an example of how much our landscapes have changed in Nebraska. So many of you know that originally in eastern Nebraska, southern Nebraska, greater prairie chickens were very abundant. In fact, they were so abundant that people could go out and do this. This is in 1890 near Grand Island. And the assumption that one has, unless there's some people hiding off camera that were camera shy, is that this is how many prairie chickens in about a day that one person and their dogs could hunt. We'll throw in some little tidbits that I found along the way that made researching the book interesting. As I talk, Kelly teaches a class now at the university, a class that I used to teach. Many of you have thought about market hunting. What you see depicted here, those were obviously going to head east on the train to Chicago, New York, to be bought and used in restaurants. And so we've thought about that period of market hunting, and usually we think about it kind of like from the ethics of it, right? And glad that market hunting was the regulations were put in place and market hunting eventually ended. But one of the interesting things in 1874, which would be 16 years before this picture was taken, there were enough prairie chickens being sent east at that point that a USDA entomologist, so a government entomologist that was working in Nebraska, wrote a report that was in the USDA annual report. There's these little books that you can look through, and I found them interesting. So here was that entomologist's concern. If we take this number of prairie chickens, and that person had contacted all the people, he was focused on about 12 counties in eastern Nebraska, and he contacted all the people in Lincoln and Omaha and nearby towns that were the wholesalers, that were the middlemen, the middle people, that were buying the prairie chickens from that guy and then selling them to somebody that would transport them. And so they had a record of how many. And he counted up and did some back of the envelope calculations based on how many grasshoppers they found in the crops of the prairie chickens. And they calculated that it would be 12, if the number of prairie chickens that had been shipped that year had not been killed, there would be 12 billion less grasshoppers in eastern Nebraska. And so it was all about crop protection. Eventually, of course, we became the bug eaters football team, and the prairie chicken was the bug eater that was eating those bugs. So I just thought you might find that interesting, that there was actually a utilitarian reason that people were upset about market hunting back in the day too, that I was very surprised to find about. But eventually, as agriculture moved in, the prairie chicken had no place to live in eastern and southern Nebraska. And so shifted to the sandhills, and that's where we find actually one of the core populations for greater prairie chicken today. But in 1920, Game and Parks started introducing ringneck pheasants because people still wanted a game bird in eastern Nebraska. The prairie chicken was gone. They needed a substitute. And so ringneck pheasants, bird from Asia, was brought in and did pretty well early on. In 1926, the editor from Outdoor Nebraska, that eventually became Nebraska Land magazine, wrote this: "Unfortunately, there were some things which the breaking plow took from us that can never be returned. One of those things was the prairie chicken. Slowly but surely, and like the Indian, he had to give way to the plow, which year after year turned under more and more sod. Today, there are very few of those native birds left in eastern Nebraska, so few that they are almost a curiosity." Now, some people would say that about pheasants today, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. "But the true pioneer does not despair when nature's laws do not fit in exactly with those of civilization. He looks for something to take its place. Perhaps it can never be as good as the original, but nevertheless something to take its place. And so pheasants blossomed after they were introduced, and farmers actually got upset that pheasants might be taking their young little seeds that they had just planted in their field. But this is a photo from a family friend of ours in 1964, and he actually told me that maybe a game warden might say something about how many pheasants they have there. But in the background, you can see how much grass is actually in that landscape behind them. So when we started keeping data on prairie chickens, this is Game and Parks data from rural mail carriers. So I think it's 4 times a year, Game and Parks sends out postcards to rural mail carriers. And they have a certain, like a handful of species that they keep track of how many they see as they do their mail routes. And this turns out to be actually an incredibly useful survey, which mirrors what their biologists do and increases the number of eyes that are out there. But this is all mail carrier data, no biologists here. And then they keep track of how many miles they drive, so you get an index of how many pheasants per, in this case, kilometer driven. And you can see they started in 1950. This is they did pheasants first, and then they've added other species since. But you can see what happened to pheasants. Now, pheasants are a bird worldwide that's known to do well in agricultural landscapes, in most agricultural landscapes. But it's what happened. So the story we're going to talk about tonight is what happened to our landscapes so that a bird that was a native bird disappeared, and the bird that was a replacement bird eventually has almost disappeared from many of our landscapes as well. You can, we can look at aerial photos for just about anywhere in the state. Some of the earliest ones are from the 1930s, and those are all kept actually at the School of Natural Resources, Hardin Hall, or Maps and More store, the same place that sells the book. In person, will be able to find you an aerial photo of just about anywhere in the state from the 1930s. And so you can look at about 90 years of difference. This is from out west in Harlan County. And you can see on the left, there's a nice little Turkey Creek is winding down through the fields there. There's agricultural fields. And then you can see what was there in 2022 in the image on the right. And so just to kind of help us focus, I've outlined a few places here. One of the things that in the leftmost rectangle, you'll see that that creek now has been straightened, so it's not doing this whirligig zip-to-do around. There's also a center pivot up there, and there's a lot more trees, right, in that riparian zone. And so there's more trees in the landscape generally in 2022, at least in some places in Nebraska. And then obviously you can see where center pivots have been put in, and so that field that's underneath the center pivot has at most, maybe that's 2 different crops there. So at most 2 crops underneath the center pivot, and usually it's just 1. So those fields are much larger and have been simplified. We could also go down on the ground and look at historic photos. So one of the things that Kelly's followed me around the state, and as I did research, I'd stop in at different places. And so this is from the Buffalo County Historical Society in Kearney. And I got really excited one day when I found the top 2 photos in different little folders that they had. The top one is from around the 1890s. This is the bridge right south of Kearney. And the top one is probably not in exactly the same place that the bridge is today, but it's close enough. And you can just see how wide, and we know that that river was shallow, but how wide that river was and how long the bridge had to be to get across it. The other one is from 1970. That's the same grain truck that my dad had when he finished about 4 years ago. So that says something about our farm in Iowa, but it was a good truck. But anyway, you can see that that river is a lot narrower. And then the picture that I took the day that I found those photos, thinking that might be a cool little collage to put together. And many of you know that nowadays, because of irrigation demands on the river, and we'll talk about the 70s in a little bit, so hold that middle image in your head from an irrigation standpoint. but many times the river is almost completely or nearly dry as it goes east in Nebraska.
What is the river?
This is the Platte, sorry, the Platte River, yes. So this is our kind of namesake, where the state of Nebraska got its name from the native, let's stay on that. So I want you to, this is from Kearney County, and if you can see, I hope everybody in the back can see, just want you to kind of look around and notice how many little farmsteads there are in this. But this is from the 1938 photo. And it's just a kind of a random spot. There's no special thing to most of us about this place on the landscape. But I thought it just was a nice little depiction of lots of little square miles and how many farmsteads there were then. One of the things we're going to talk about tonight is how change happens in bursts, and things kind of happen all at once. And I want you to think about all the farmsteads that you see there, all have a farmhouse, and every farmhouse has a dining room table or a kitchen table. And that's the table that the people that live in that house gather around to talk about the decisions for what kind of crops we're going to plant next year, decisions about the farm, you know, are we going to sell the farm, all these big important decisions. But more I'm thinking about like what the annual decisions they're making as they do that. And so in the book I wrote, values for landscape components such as wetlands and trees and grass and crops and rivers vary among people, which leads some farmers to see unutilized cropland at the bottom of a wetland, while others might appreciate the slog of cattails and open water as habitat for ducks and an opportunity to build a blind for hunting. The farmers and ranchers with which I've worked are unique individuals, and most would describe themselves as independent thinkers. However, it's been common for strong influences to coordinate and synchronize the decisions made in farm units across large expanses of rural landscapes. And I find this dynamic to be intriguing. How do all those strong-willed, independent people of the earth suddenly make the same choice at the same time? So I think you probably all know, if you haven't, some of you have been farmers and ranchers, some of you know farmers and ranchers. They tend to be very, they would describe themselves as strong-willed, independent people. So it's even more impressive that the changes that have happened on our landscape have happened in the speed that they have, relatively speaking. So I call those dynamic conductors, those forces. They're conductors, not in the sense of a train, like the tracks that are being laid there, but just in like a more of an orchestra. They're a force that all of a sudden everybody starts playing to the same tune. And so one of the first examples of this would be the railroad that was put in 1869, I think, right, was the Golden Spike. And so the Union Pacific Railroad coming through Nebraska, and you can see the construction here. That railroad split, among other things, it split the bison herd, north and south bison herds, and it hastened the removal of bison from the plains and ultimately hastened the removal of the people, the native people that had been living on the plains. And so one of the I tried to find a lot of journal articles and things to include in the book, and so one of the journal entries that I found was by a Lieutenant General John Schofield. He was working with Bill Cody, Buffalo Bill Cody, who was using the railroad after it was completed to bring famous guests. Many times they were from Europe. They were famous people, and many times that they would come out on the railroad with their whole entourage, and this would be a mammoth party that would go out. Many people that would go out on a bison hunt, buffalo hunt, and so the Army would provide protection for it. And so this Lieutenant General was one of those people that was with this. And it was a hunt for the Grand Duke Alexis of Russia in 1872. And he wrote, "With my cavalry and combined artillery encamped in front, I wanted no other occupation in life than to ward off the savage and kill off his food until there would no longer be an Indian frontier in our beautiful country. And so, in the pulse of things, if you'll permit me some latitude, I know things were happening before then and after then, but really from 1830 to 1870, the bulk of the bison were removed and the bulk of our native people were removed from the plains. And so on the top, these two images were taken 70 miles apart from each other in the central valley of the Platte River. The top was a Pawnee village and the bottom are homesteaders. My dad would shake his head looking at that corn crop with those homesteaders, but that was their attempts, right? But that dynamic happened very quickly, and from a use of the landscape, we think about the native people who were not as big in numbers, and so were more focused in certain places on the landscape, but had their impacts on the landscape. But then to settlers that were, every square mile had multiple homesteads to the point where we have the image that we just looked at with the farmsteads. Here's another interesting figure, USDA data. This is yield data, bushels per acre. On the top is corn and sorghum. On the bottom is wheat and oats. And the little black dots on the top are corn. Sorghum apparently didn't come along for a little while. But what you can see is until about 1945, and this might have been in the Hitler talk, if you can remember graphs and figures for that long. So apologies if you've seen this before, but we'll test your memory. So you can see what happens to corn yield from the 1866 when we started collecting this type of data until 1945. You can see on the bottom, oats are the open dots, and they're declining. Wheat doesn't decline. Maybe it actually increases slightly. It's bouncing around. Maybe we'll call it stable. But what's happened to corn and oat yields? Are people just becoming worse and worse farmers? Yeah, fertilizer, right? So what did they have to put in the soil to help with that? It was manure from their livestock, right? That's all they had to reconstitute it. And so basically they called it the soil problem. The soil was being depleted by the new crops that were being planted on every square mile. And so they were being depleted every year. And so we can see that in the yield data. So what happened in 1945? You talk about the most dramatic shift of any figure that I could probably show you tonight.
Irrigation.
Okay. Fertilizer comes along. And the
hybrid corn.
Okay, we got two of the three that I'm going to show you. Anything else? How about something that might take care of those grasshoppers that people were?
Pesticides.
Insecticides, yep. Okay, so World War II, and this was kind of the point of the Hitler talk a few years ago, was that there was just a lot of technology that was either developed around the time of World War II or because of World War II, our production of it increased. And so the ability to take, to make synthetic ammonia from atmospheric compounds under pressure and heat, to make ammonia that now is put on as anhydrous ammonia. That's the nitrogen fertilizer that most farmers are putting on to their fields. That started because in the war we were making TNT that had a nitrogen-based explosive, and so the plants that made those explosives were able, after the war, to transition to sell fertilizer and to keep that, utilize that process. I'm sure some of them kept making the TNT for other things too, but it's probably a certainty. But the point is, like, there all of a sudden was this process that could make those fertilizers, and you can see. So the top panel at the top shows from Nebraska Farmer Magazine a very conclusive ad for fertilizer that had figures from the university next to it that showed all data that you need to know if you're a farmer, that if I use nitrogen fertilizer, my wife is going to get a new apron or a dress. She's going to be able to buy a new kitchen tablecloth and to put new curtains in. And so everything red there was things that you could buy with your profits. Before the war, hybrid seed corn had been developed. So somebody mentioned hybrid seed corn. And this was a big thing. My dad tells a story of my grandpa who told him initially, like, the farmer's job is to grow seed. Why would I pay somebody else for my seed? And so that was the mentality at first. But then the next year he saw a neighbor who had popped for a couple bags of hybrid seed corn and the big pile of corn that was outside their barn, and he decided that he might try a bag of it next year too. And the rest is history, because it was also, it actually paid for itself to use this new seed that had hybrid vigor, which was also nutrient hungry, so the fact that now we had fertilizer could actually play into that as well. And then during the war, especially in northern Africa, we had DDT, chlordane, all these insecticides that we were using to prevent mosquitoes and other insects while we were fighting over there. They had an agricultural use when it came back. And so all those things together, plus a lot of other things, I'm sure, if we spent more time on it, is what resulted in those yields increasing. And so that's something that's happening in the background, but the point is it's a very quick burst of when we kind of things transitioning from one status to another. A landscape that we're all familiar with in Nebraska, that if you take an aerial photo of many places in western, especially once you get kind of outside of Lancaster County and start heading west, you see landscapes that have a lot of those circles in them. I took an image like that back to some students that I left at the University of Dubuque when I came here in 2001. This summer, 25 years, Mark, you said it'd been a while, but it just seems like that fast. But those students in eastern Iowa had no idea what that picture was. Really? They just couldn't comprehend it. So there was like jokes about aliens and stuff that made those circles. Like we know that because of center pivots here in Nebraska. But so the technology, the point is the technology really has affected our landscapes. The centrifugal pump drew water from deeper in the groundwater, and then in 1950, Doherty got the designs from a guy in Colorado and started making center pivots here. I think it's the Valmont group started making center pivots here in Nebraska, and the rest of that's history too. But that's the technology that went into that. And so here's the figure that shows how fast. I said in 1950 those plans came in. So in 1950 is on the left there, and you can see irrigated acres is the solid line. And you can see that by 1980, really, we've hit the asymptote of how many irrigated acres at least were on this. And so in 30 years, really, we went from very little irrigated acres in Nebraska, so another pulse where the landscape just changed dramatically because of that. I've got the 1974, 1973 marked there as the year that we were 50-50, and we haven't looked back ever since. And then the 1970s keep coming up in diagrams. I've got 1972 marked here. Another conductor. These are all conductors, whether it's technology, the railroad, various conductors here. And so you can think about global economic demands and global economic markets. In 1972, Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture and signed the Russian grain deal. And so all of a sudden we had a global ag economy. There had been export, but this was the first caused big demand. And so what you can see is, if you look at the different crops, corn is the solid dots on the top. And actually you can see that corn had been kind of slowly declining over time until about that point. And then corn starts to take off again. And then there's this new little interesting crop that hadn't been on the landscape before, and that's soybeans. And I remember we moved to the farm that that my dad and mom still live on in 1975. And soybeans, there's some stories in the book about my mom trying to figure out what to do with this soybean because she was sure that we ought to be able to eat this thing. And so she was roasting it in the oven, and grinding it for flour, and we finally gave up. And but there was a period of time where she experimented. She was a home ec teacher, and so she experimented with soybeans because it was a new thing. It was an oddity. And so what's going to happen? What can we do with this thing? And so now we talk about Nebraska being a corn and soybean state, which it is. A couple lessons from this. You can also see that many of those small grains started to decline. So our wheat, oats, barley, sorghum just started to disappear and fade out. Now, if you're a pheasant, those are the crops that you could actually find some food in. You might be able to nest in those acres. Certainly, you're not going to build a nest in a corn or a soybean field, and so that is one explanation for the decline in pheasants that you see from the 1950s, when we had a very diverse agricultural landscape, which was what pheasants like worldwide. The other thing that I'll just say here, if we're thinking about the future, is that graph has never stayed the same. So Nebraska may be a corn and soybean state now, but let's come back in 30 or 40 years and see if it still is. Maybe it will be. Maybe those forces will just keep it as those are the two crops, and we know what to do with those two crops. They say like 95% of everything in the grocery store has corn in it in some way. So maybe that demand will keep corn and soybeans there. But one lesson from that graph is that things change over time. And so we end up, we're back to the pheasant, and we kind of think about what we've lost and what we've gained over time. Well, so that landscape change has been dramatic. All those conductors caused the landscape change that we saw to a landscape of all those center pivots covering it. And so you see this decline in pheasants. Now, I also started looking at some other data. This is not in the book, so this is like free baseball, like the 10th inning. You're getting some free images here. But look at 1972, and Orobats and the Russian grain deal, plant fence row to fence row, and let's really start focusing on those two crops. And this graph shows white-tailed deer, that's the WT, and mule deer. Mule deer are out west, white-tailed deer are in the east, where more of that corn landscape is. And then we've got both sexes, essentially. We've got bucks and antlerless deer. So there's two lines for each species. Antlerless is mostly the females. Or a buck that's had is either too young to have big antlers yet, or has run into a fence and doesn't have its antlers anymore. That's two ways you can be antlerless and be a buck. But the tangent, I can stay on task. 1972, isn't it just amazing, after 1972, what happens to deer populations in eastern Nebraska? So pheasants don't like corn quite so much. They like to eat it, but they don't like corn fields. Deer love corn, and it makes their populations go high. Here's another one. We started looking at different things. Snow geese. So numerous that there's a spring hunting season, almost unlimited. People are worried about their population has increased so much. We're worried about them eating the tundra out where they breed up north. And 1972. I mean, maybe it's a coincidence. But they certainly, their population survival and their reproduction are enhanced when they come through Nebraska and other parts of their migratory route and eat corn. And they're much better physiologically when they get up north because they've got all those nutrients. And so they've got more eggs, and they survive at higher rates in their population. Boom. So there, it's not all doom and gloom, right? That said, your group is very familiar with the stories of the 3 billion birds that have been lost since the 1970s. And of those 3 billion, 720 million are estimated to be grassland birds. Grassland habitats are the habitat that's been the most impacted by agriculture. And isn't it interesting that the people at Cornell that did this started counting in the 70s? So 1970s is coming back and forth in our conversation all along. It shows the eastern meadowlark here. We have the western meadowlark as our state bird, obviously. We have eastern meadowlarks in eastern Nebraska, but I can tell you that both those species, if we look in Nebraska at breeding bird surveys, have declined, even though the western meadowlark has the sandhills, and the eastern meadowlark are found there too. Even though we have the sandhills as a very big contiguous grassland, the populations have still declined in Nebraska. Now, so that's gains and losses of some of our wildlife things. Obviously, the thing that we've gained as a society is that Nebraska has gone from being a place that was predicted to be the Great American Desert and where agriculture should never be thought about, to either the third or this says the fourth. My vice chancellor tells me that I shouldn't show this picture, and I should tell you it's the third, because apparently some data sets say that we're the third, and they want to beat Iowa eventually here in Nebraska. But as an Iowa boy, I'm like, I don't think that's going to happen. But Iowa gets rain more dependably, or at least it has in the past. But anyway, think of that. Like we've gone from a place that you shouldn't actually try to plant crops to being the fourth most profitable state for agriculture in the United States. The point being, nobody set out. It was no one's intention, to use the book title, to make pheasants decline and to make meadowlarks decline. There were some species, like wolves, mountain lions, bears, that people said, yeah, we're not so happy about those. This is 100 years ago, 150 years ago, we'll get rid of those species. We'll have a purposeful intent to remove those species from our landscape. But there's actually been a lot of money spent on both pheasants and other grassland birds by conservation organizations, by our state wildlife agency, to try to keep pheasants on the landscape, despite all the changes that are happening on that landscape. And so the point is that we didn't have the intention to make those populations go down. Our intention at the time was to make a food, fuel, and fiber producing landscape work as efficiently as we could, and we did extremely well at that. So that was the intention. And maybe we had the best of intentions, hence the title. But there's some other things that fall from that, and one of those is, this is a map of nitrate and groundwater and wells around Nebraska, and you can see that nitrate levels vary. They vary by soil type, there's a lot of things that cause, even with the same fertilizer inputs, there's a lot of things that cause well water to have different nitrate levels. But if anything's dark orange or purple, it's above the 10 milligrams per liter. That's the health level that's set. And so those are communities that are having to deal with treating their water and spending a lot of money to do that. So I want to end by talking about, so what do we do as we move forward? Let's talk about a proactive thing and how we as conservation, you're part of a conservation organization, you are a conservation organization, how do we work together for the future? And so let's talk about environmental design. I think the title of the talk was something about designing our landscapes for the future. This is a land leveler that was used and this would have been out in that landscape that had a little center pivots in it. Probably pre-center pivot, they were probably trying to level it so that they could have flow-through irrigation before they had the center pivot technology. But the point is here, we're really good at designing landscapes for purposes. And in this case, the idea is we're going to take every little roll and ridge out of this field and we're going to make it completely flat. In 1935, I've got my notes up here so I say the right dates, there was a big flood in the Republican River and it killed a lot of people. This is during the Depression, during the Dust Bowl, and so you're like, Dust Bowl flood, that's interesting. But there were rain events during the Dust Bowl. But because of agriculture, water goes off of land much more quickly than it did when it was all grassland. I know you have a lot of grassland patches and you probably have heard that's one of the benefits of your prairie areas is absorption of water into the soil. And the Civilian Conservation Corps, there were work programs during the Depression. They started giving landowners, these workers, so this was federal input on their land to create these terraces all across the landscape. Today, I always thought of the terraces on my dad's farm as like a decision that he made to prevent erosion in his field, which I believe actually was the case when he created them. But back then, this was landscape design. This was somebody purposeful. And the city of Lincoln is actually thinking about similar things right now because of Salt Creek and the flood risks that we have. And how do we design the landscapes? How do we, maybe we encourage people in the Salt Valley watershed to plant cover crops to increase organic nature in the soils to get more water. It prolongs the flow of water in, so it doesn't flow as fast into Salt Creek. Same thing here, all over the state. Again, in Outdoor Nebraska magazine, in 1935, just weeks after the flood, the editor wrote, "Man by his folly caused the Republican River flood. Nature gave us a valley sufficiently large to carry away the surface water that its tributaries brought in from a grass-covered area. If man drains the water into the streams too rapidly, because of the removal of the grass, and the stream beds are too small to hold the enormous volume, then man must also assume the ensuing responsibility." And by 1965, just 30 years later, the USDA estimated that in Nebraska there were enough terraces that had been built, and many of them had been built with tractors, not just with people out with shovels. If you put all the terraces end to end, they would circle the equator 4 times. And that's how. So my point is, like, we can make a landscape if we want to make a landscape, right? If there's a purpose and there's lives at stake, if our future is at stake, we can affect the landscape. And that picture here is one that I took of a current landscape with all those terraces outlined by the snow. We were chasing some prairie chickens with radio collars that, well, they weren't lost. They knew where they were, but we couldn't find them. And so we were up in an airplane. They won't tell us where they are. But anyway, we can design landscapes. We also have, not only can we can design landscape, but we can educate people very effectively, and that's another, actually, one of these conductors on landscape is whether it's an NRD or an irrigation district or extension, we have stuff like this that as Nebraskans we've done to share new technology, new ways of doing things, to spread those ideas very quickly. So I want to take you to my dad's farm. This is in southern Iowa, so I'm sorry, the rest of the book's about Nebraska, but there's a little bit of me in it every once in a while from Iowa. But he's got some design elements. So what do we mean by environmental design? One of those design elements is here in the foreground, and you can see that those rows of corn here are planted on the contour. So there's a hill that's draining this way. Now the problem is, eventually the hill kind of goes over the rise and it starts to drain that way, and then this one starts to drain that way. So this is actually, many farmers wouldn't take the time to figure all this out. My dad on his 730 John Deere loved to go out there and figure out where to put all these rows so that the contours could meet. And this was before GPS and everything. But he thought it was really important to use contour. And so that, because it's on the contour, you've got corn stalks, soybean stalks, that you've got little teeny dams every 30 inches that are going down the hill, keeping water, a little bit of water, keeping the erosion from happening. So contour farming. There's also grassed waterways. So here's a draw, here's a draw, there's a draw down here. And so I think there's a draw. So he's got, these are all draws that water gets funneled into, and it would be a big erosion gully if that grass wasn't there. If you just planted through it in the spring and planted corn, there wouldn't be enough corn stalks to keep the water back. He also has some terraces, and they're a little hard to see because of the other design elements, but he's got one there. It's actually easier to show some terraces in some of the neighbors' fields. There's some terraces, you can see the grass on the terraces growing. But on each one of his kind of major hill slopes there, he's got some terraces that he's built in. But then about 10 years ago, in his words, we started getting more rain in bigger storms and bigger bursts rather than lots of little rains. And so he was noticing that change in the climate. And rather than spend more money on terraces, he bought into a program, he bought into it by planting the seeds. These are prairie strips. So it's a program in Iowa. And so these are little prairie strips. You may have heard of the program. It's available here in Nebraska. It can be part of the Farm Bill. And so there's a strip about a third of the way down the field or down the hill, and then there's another strip down right by the creek. And so that design keeps as much soil in the field as possible and slows down the water. Again, builds organic in that strip. And then he's got another design, the Ray Powell Special, I call it, that you'll notice that every 12 rows there's corn, corn, corn. Those were the soybeans in between were replaced with this prairie strip, but there's soybeans, soybeans, and then over here he's got soybeans, corn, soybeans, corn. So he's got these, it's called strip cropping, but that keeps corn, which has bigger stalks and does a better job slowing down erosion. So he was all about soil erosion. He wanted to have the most techniques in his field possible to save the soil that he had. And I think it's because he heard stories from his dad about the Dust Bowl and the problems the farmers used to have. So that's what we mean by some of those design elements. But if you look in the background, you'll see that Ray Powell is kind of a weird guy. His field is unique, right? Most of the fields around are a single crop, first of all, and they might have a terrace. Maybe there's a grass waterway, but they don't have all of those design elements. So the question might be like, what kind of incentives would we need to encourage what he's doing to spread around the landscape? So let's talk just a little bit about incentives. 3 panels here. We'll work through them quickly, I promise. The top one is corn prices in bushels per acre since the dawn of time in Nebraska. Since we started keeping, it's 1910, we started keeping that, that data was available. And what I want you to notice is corn prices don't go up with the cost of living. So by the time we're done with this, you're going to understand the plight of the farmer just a little bit more. Corn prices stay the same for about 30 years on average in Nebraska. So there was this, period of time where there was about like $1 until World War II, and demands after World War II brought it up to about $1.50. And then 1972, remember that we talked about global, that bumped price up to $2.30. And I remember as a kid, $2.30 was what we wanted to sell our corn for every year. That was like what we hoped for. Are we gonna, like, that was just the point that, the comparison from the year before. But and then ethanol demand, which I know you'd probably like to talk about more, but that bumped up the demand and we've got a lot of variation going on with those higher prices since then. But so we've had 4 steps. One point there is that think about being a farmer and getting to like the 28th year, and you're still getting the same for your corn that you did 30 years ago, but the input prices haven't stopped, right? The fertilizer keeps going up every year. The hybrid seed corn is getting more expensive every year, but you're still getting the same price. So when you hear farmers complain about input costs, it's that graph they're talking about. And just to illustrate with my personal life, 1972, I was 4 years old. The ethanol boom happened the year I got tenure at the University of Nebraska. So corn prices were the same for my dad from the time I was 4 till the time he had a son that finally made it at the university. Same corn price, okay? He was really happy after I got tenure, maybe not because I got tenure, but because his corn went. The second panel is land values. And what you can see is when corn prices go up, land values go up in Nebraska. And so it's easier to see on the right 2 times that happens because the graph is a little bigger. But there's this bump and a correction, and it keeps going up. And so that's why land is a good investment. It generally keeps going up. But there's variation in how it goes up. The bottom graph is a little index that I made to try to illustrate the booms and busts in agriculture. And so this is land value. The bottom graph is land value as a ratio of what it was 10 years ago. So in 1920, the ratio value is 2. And that means in 1920, land values were twice what they were on average in Nebraska in 1910, 10 years before. Okay? Does that make sense? So 1920, people are like, hey, our land we could sell it for twice what we bought it for in 1910. maybe they were happy about that. But you can see what happened if they didn't sell, and they got into the Depression, and it actually went below, not even counting for inflation, it went below what they'd paid for it 10 years, and there was a long period of time, and that's why it was the Great Depression, that it was below 1, the index value. But then it pops up as corn prices go up after World War II. There's a surge in the economy, and then the recession of the 1950s comes along, and we're back into another trough, and land values go down again. Go back up again, and then the farm crisis of the 1980s. This was the time that we almost lost our farm. Came one letter from the bank away from losing the farm. And a lot of people did lose their farms during that because their land was worth less than what they paid for it, and they had gotten a bunch of loans to buy new machinery and everything because people said you should do that. And that's how they got upside down. After that, we start going up again after the ethanol boom. 2012 was a great year. And then since then, look what's happening. Isn't that interesting? So, politics, legislature, the reason that we're talking about property tax change, the reason that during these bust times, all of a sudden it becomes politically expedient to try to help farmers. Okay? So we're entering a time period where farmers are starting to feel a little pain, and they're complaining about property taxes because their inputs and their costs they're getting for their crops, the balance sheet isn't starting to add up again. And so this is why we see a lot of politicians in Nebraska paying attention to what's happening in rural Nebraska. If that helps explain, just like, I'm not saying that like what the governor's suggesting gets done to solve that is a good thing. I'm just saying that's why the governor is making suggestions. All right? So, but the whole point of this was not to talk about economics per se. It was we were supposed to be talking about incentives. So we'll get back on track. During those troughs, the Great Depression, the recession of the 1950s, and the farm crisis, there were innovative conservation programs that were developed. So in the Depression, the Soil Conservation Act, it was the first time really that the federal government sent checks to farmers. And they sent checks to farmers if they agreed to plant certain crops that were better for the soil than corn. Corn was on the bad list. Oats, wheat, barley, these types of things were on the good list. Alfalfa, things that would hold the soil, okay? And so that was a public good. We could use taxpayer money, give it to farmers. It got contested in court. They had to do it the right way. But they did it because it was a public good. It was saving our soil as a nation, and it was protecting water quality for all of us. Okay, so that's the public good. In the 1950s, the innovation was to pay farmers to put native habitat back on the landscape. So not just plant interesting crops, but we're going to plant grass instead of crops, which will raise the price of corn because now there's less supply and there's still the same demand, so price goes up. That was the idea. And then in the 1950s, one of the reasons that Game and Parks number of pheasants in 1950 was pretty high was because the soil bank program during that time, there was a lot of pheasants back out on the landscape because there was more grass on the landscape. And then in the 1980s, the innovation is what we know as the Conservation Reserve Program today. Came along. That was the first year of that program. So these are all farm bill type things, but the innovation happened during these times where it was politically expedient to do something to save farmers economically with a public good that we could use for conservation purposes. And so the question for us is, what might be coming? Are we getting to a point where there could be another politically expedient time and we could do something much more innovative than we're even doing now on the landscape for conservation? And so what might that look like? Well, we'll go back to Dad's farm. What if every farmer had incentives to plant 5 to 10% of their land into grass or trees or some kind of native habitat? I don't know exactly what the percentage is that you're looking in this field. I'm guessing that's more like 10 to 15% of not crops that Dad has in his field. But what about 5 or 10%? You're crazy, you say. Well, this year in Nebraska, last year in 2025, we had, the acres don't mind. We had 600,000 acres of CRP. We have 22 million acres of cropland. That's 3% of our cropland was actually in CRP. So we're at 3% already. The problem is it's not distributed on every farm. It's out there in big blocks that are sometimes kind of randomly assorted on the landscape because you have to have a willing farmer that wants to apply for the program. What if we could take that, even though it's really good to have big blocks of land for a lot of other reasons, like producing birds, harder for a predator to find you if you're in a big block of grass than a small block of grass. But ignoring that for a moment, what if we could spread that out, that same 3%? Let's just stay with 3% and take it across the landscape. That's the kind of thing that might be interesting. The cool thing is, it might already be being done in some places. So this is a graph from Wisconsin, and it shows a watershed that's got some nutrient problems. And so the people in that watershed have come together and decided they're going to tackle their nitrate problems in their grass, in their drinking water. The little tan strips there are the strips that are the prairie strips that you saw in my dad's field. And they were being applied by a computer algorithm to optimize where the best places are in that watershed to put those to prevent nutrients from running off too much into the stream. There's also a second thing that we haven't talked about yet, but you know about them. They're wetlands. And wetlands are great, right? Because they also have natural processes that take those things out of the water, help purify the water. And so they've got strategic places that those wetlands should be placed. This is a program, this Ag Conservation Planning Framework was come up with. Some folks at Iowa State started developing part of the processes, and this is spreading around. Some of our climate scientists in the School of Natural Resources are using this framework as they're working with some watersheds with farmers in Nebraska. So it's being implemented on the landscape, and this is, I think, is one example of what the future could look like if we're really serious about environmental design. One of my favorite political cartoonists was Ding Darling. He was the first head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so this is from the 1940s, and there was a lot of conservation groups that had sprung up because of all the things that were happening, market hunting and blah, 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 loss of soil. And what you can see on top is that you've got these different groups separately trying to do their own thing, working on soil, working on wildlife, working on birds. They've got their own log, they're trying to start it on fire, they can't get it done. And Ding said, hey, if you all would work together, we could have a roaring fire if we put all of our conservation minds together. And I think that's a good thing for us to keep in mind as we move forward. I'm director for the School of Natural Resources now. I'm having a hoot doing that for the last almost 3 years. And time, again, is going by pretty fast in that gig, too. But I'll just say, one of the things that I'm having a lot of fun is going around talking to partners and see how the school can show up at the table, sometimes for the first time, and be a part of these conversations about partnerships and really enjoy the work that we do with all the different types of Audubons out there, whether it's the region or Spring Creek Prairie or a local club like yourselves. And an example of that type of collaboration is a new thing that we're just getting off the ground in the last 9 months called the Central Flyway Resilience Collaborative. The School of Natural Resources, Platte Basin Time Lapse, and the International Crane Foundation. We had a conversation, and the question was, can the Central Flyway, a really important flyway in our neck of the woods, right up straight through the gut, that's the cranes, right? But it's also ducks, insects, lots of other things go up and down the Central Flyway. Could we get to a point where the Central Flyway landscape is so developed that all those stopover sites don't exist anymore? And could we actually be at a point where we don't have a functional flyway? This is what we're trying to prevent. So let's be proactive, make sure that flyway stays there. And the idea then is to work with communities that are based near those specific stopover sites that are very important, working with landowners, around that might farm around those wetlands, that might have those on some of their ranch land, and determine the best ways that we can make sure that they're able to keep producing with agriculture and make money on the investment that they've made in their family's land, that the communities thrive, that they have good drinking water for the community, and that the waterfowl, cranes, everything that's going up and down, the migratory birds, are successful as well, instead of the three of those things kind of competing with each other. And you can see the group of folks that came together in November. We had our inaugural meeting to talk about next steps to do this. So we're still in the talking phase and putting this collaborative together before we start to work with communities. But the idea is to spread it from Nebraska up and down the flyway to some of these other universities that are listed there. But I think that's a coalition of folks that Ding Darling would approve of. So there's no question that we can shape our landscapes. We will shape our landscapes in the future. We're at a good time now. With all the experiences we've had and gone over, we can see the patterns through time. We've got the data to show what happens if you do certain things to the landscape. We understand landscape ecology. We've got plant biologists and wildlife biologists and all these folks that can talk about the spatial complexities of landscapes. And we also know from looking at some of the choices that people have made in the past, they often did it with the best of intentions to feed their family, to make a return on that investment in their land. But we can see that some of those decisions had staying power and that they spread pretty quickly if they make sense to a lot of people. And so the question really is, will we in the future, can we work together to shape the land the way that we need it to be sustainable for our future? So there's a lot of other stories that didn't fit into the talk tonight. I hope if you take a peek at the book, I hope you enjoy it. It was a lot of fun to write. Again, I can't remember if I said this, but it took 20 years to get done. But it was kind of the fruit of all labors. And so it's got a lot of stories and experiences from the time that I've worked here at the university. And love our adopted state of Nebraska, and it was fun to write about it. So thanks for hanging with me, and happy to answer questions as you have time.
We have two mics to go around with questions. I got a quickie for you. Does your parents farm? Have they seen an increase in biodiversity, do you think?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is that, like, I would say even my dad's farm, until when he put those prairie strips in, that really increased. So the test for this, he's got those 12-row strips. And when you come down, he has a 6-row harvest combine. And when you come down that last part of the strip with the last 6 rows, you're taking all the corn and there's no corn around you, and it's what flushes out at the end, right? So that's the test. And for several years, when neighbors didn't have any grass in their landscape, there weren't any quail or pheasants or bunnies that popped out of the end of those rows. But it's been fun. He retired, and so I haven't gotten to be a farmer for about 3 years now. But toward the end, when he had those strips, it was actually really fun to see those things back on his farm. So.
I want to step in. Oops. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
this one, Linda.
I want to step in and say thank you to Larkin. I spent some time with his book and I recommend it. I recommend it particularly because I'm 83. My dad was 100, mostly lived in Nebraska, and he told me lots of stories. Our whole family was shaped by the Dust Bowl and his just feeling like we had to be so careful, the Depression, and yet I didn't have the research behind it that Larkin has done in order to put together all those influences that make the situation what it is in our lives today on this landscape. So I thank you.
Appreciate that.
And buy the book.
There's a reason why there's a certain demographic of folks that keep every margarine tub or every butter tub, right? Because they lived through that time, and that's what I see. My mom didn't live through it, but her mom did, and my mom still has those stacks of every kind of plastic thing that she uses gets kept. Ron?
I just want to comment, some cultures recognize the wisdom of elders, and you consult the elders, I think Native American cultures maybe, and what you've captured is a lot of the wisdom of elders from old photos and old things, and the comment over here, a person 100 years old who lived through something, that passion doesn't come through to somebody who's never talked, where that elder person has seen it, and bringing those two together is powerful for helping the future understand the pain of the past. And so with our technology, which wasn't then, we could pull the two together, use the wisdom of the elders and what you presented that elders have written, and to bring the future in a better plan, intention. I think it's what you're got.
No, I appreciate that very much. And there's a lot of, there is some Larkin in the book just to kind of add my experiences that relate, especially maybe during the latter parts of the book, but tried to use a lot of journals from settlers that went through, or stories. You know, it's harder to capture the wisdom of Native Americans because we don't have a written record of a lot of that, but there are ways that, and so tried my very best to capture that too. Newspapers, the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and then the online version of the Nebraska Land Magazine now that goes back to 1820. I mean, there's just some amazing things that you can see how people were reacting at the time, and the ads that were being put in those newspapers during certain times. So those stories, trying to capture the wisdom of that era, as you say. So appreciate that.
I was wondering, does your dad raise Roundup ready crops? The reason I asked that, it seems like that does complicate it a little bit.
Yep.
To keep it from drifting on your prairie strips.
Yeah. So they have to be careful as they do that. Yes. And so, but there's life is just complicated, right? But you talk about another burst that we could have talked about. Dad was using what he called conservation tillage. It was not no tillage, but he didn't plow and he didn't disc. He had a cultivator that he went through the field and prepared it for the planter. Basically, it just threw everything into a ridge, and then he came through with a planter and it planted in that ridge. And then one more time, he cultivated during the summer for weeds. And that was all the tillage he did. Then, when Roundup came along, all of a sudden no-till took off. And we've been trying to convince people to do no-till cropping forever. But the thing that finally made it happen was this herbicide technology. And then all of a sudden, so soil protection actually probably benefited from the advent of Roundup, because you don't have to, you don't go through the field anymore. And you use a no-till planter, and so he had to switch to a no-till planter. But and lots of other things we could say about Roundup, but yes, he had to spray very carefully. And now that it's the guy that's leasing from him, of course, hires these big, huge sprayers to go through the field. Dad's sprayer was almost literally just a little bit bigger than my arms, maybe twice as big. I mean, he just had a very small sprayer. So it was easier for him to not spray on top of that, or to make sure it wasn't windy and drifting. But they have to be really careful now with those big rigs that they keep his prairie strips there.
Just one comment, and I'd like your thoughts too, is I'm convinced that one of the biggest reforms we could make is with property tax, because if they weren't so high, there wouldn't be such an incentive to farm every inch of the land. You know, you could afford to leave some land idle. You know,
So those economic pressures are part of the bottom line for sure. Yep.
How about one more question before we end the evening? Got one more question out here?
No, go ahead.
Okay, we'll let Linda go with then we'll take, I'm sure Larkin will stick around for a few minutes
Sure.
afterwards, so.
I don't know
so Lana,
anything
go ahead.
about this stuff, but when they kept cleaning out the ditches all the time, you wonder if they're still doing that so much or not.
From the soil that's
Well,
come
you
out
have
of.
new roads or whatever, and then they clean out all the ditches, and it almost looks like, we go out and drive around, and it looks like gardens, or, what am I trying to say?
There's nothing there.
It looks like city, you know, because there's no ditches, there's hardly any trees, there's hardly any.
Yes, so the kind of the planting fence row to fence row, just in some cases almost to the edge of the road if they can. And so that ethanol boom, if you think about windbreaks that were in our landscapes, often because of the Dust Bowl influence. In Nebraska, people like windbreaks. And they do have some the benefits. Ron can tell us that on crops. There's been research at the university on windbreaks and crops. But the add all of a sudden this extra money you could get from a bushel of corn or a bushel of soybeans after the ethanol boom took off and biodiesel, that meant people were getting that extra 20 yards that used to be a tree row on the edge of their field. And so there was a lot of those lost during that time, for sure.
Well, let's
So-
thank Larkin for coming.
Appreciate
tonight.
the invitation to come. Thank you very much.
Be sure and stop up and get a book signed afterwards. I'm sure Larkin will stick around for a few questions. We've got some snacks out there, some cookies, and also when you leave, make sure you signed in and sign a postcard if you'd like, so we can send that to National Audubon. So thanks again for coming out tonight.
Fun. Okay. Fill mine out quick.
Right.